This article gives a historical overview of Christian positions on persecution of Christians, persecutions by Christians, religious persecution and toleration. Christian theologians like Augustine of Hippo and Thomas Aquinas had legitimized religious persecution to various extents, and during the Late Antiquity and the Middle Ages, Christians considered heresy and dissent to be punishable offences. However, early modern Europe witnessed the turning point in the history of Christian thought on persecution and tolerance. Christian writers like John Milton and John Locke argued for limited religious toleration, and later secular authors like Thomas Jefferson developed the concept of religious freedom. Christians nowadays generally accept that heresy and dissent are not punishable by a civil authority. Many Christians look back on the centuries of persecution with a mixture of revulsion and incomprehension. Historical background. Early Christianity was a minority religion in the Roman Empire, and the early Christians were themselves persecuted during that time. After Constantine I converted to Christianity, it became the dominant religion in the Roman Empire. Already beginning under his reign, Christian heretics were persecuted. The most extreme case was the burning of Priscillian and 6 of his followers at the stake in 383. In the view of many historians, the Constantinian shift turned Christianity from a persecuted into a persecuting religion. Beginning in the late 4th century AD, also the ancient pagan religions were actively suppressed. After the decline of the Roman Empire, the further Christianization of Europe was to a large extent peaceful, although Jews and Muslims were harshly prosecuted to an extent of forced conversions in Byzantine Empire. Encounters between Christians and pagans were sometimes confrontational, and some Christian kings were known for the violence against pagans. The persecution of Christian heretics resumed in 1022, when 14 people were burned at Orleans. Around this time Bogomilism and Catholicism appeared in Europe. These sects were seen as heretic by the Catholic Church, and the Inquisition was initially established to counter them. Heavily persecuted, these heresies were eradicated by the 14th century. The suppression of the Cathar faith took the form of the Albigensian Crusade, a 20-year military campaign initiated by the Roman Catholic Church. Its violence was extreme even by medieval standards. Notable individuals who were executed for heresy in the late Middle Ages are Jerome of Prague, John Badby and Jan Hus. Only the Waldensians, another heretical Christian sect, managed to survive in remote areas in northern Italy. Also during the late Middle Ages, the Crusades pitched Christians and Muslims against each other in a war about the possession of Jerusalem, with atrocities from both sides. There were massacres of Muslims and Jews when Jerusalem was taken by Crusaders in 1099. There were also the Northern Crusades, against the remaining pagans in Northern Europe. As a result, the pagan religions in Europe disappeared almost completely. After Grand Duchy of Moscow and later the Tsardom had conquered the Kazan Khanate and Astrakhan Khanate in the 1550s, the government forcibly baptized Muslim Volga Tatars and pagan Chalvash, Mordva and Mari. Mosques were prohibited. This persecution ended only under the reign of Catherine II of Russia in the late 18th century. The Spanish and Portuguese Inquisition also went on to persecute Jews and Muslims. In Spain after the Reconquista, Jews were forced to either convert or be exiled. Many were killed. The persecution of Jews goes back to 12th century Visigothic Spain after the emergence of the blood libel against Jews. Although the Spanish had agreed to allow Muslims the freedom of religion in 1492, this was often ignored. In 1501, Muslims were offered the choice of conversion or exile. In 1556, Arable Muslim dress was forbidden, and in 1566 Arabic language as a whole was prohibited in Spain. Jews were eventually expelled from England by King Edward I, too. When Martin Luther wrote his 95 Theses in 1517, Catholicism reacted the same way as it had to the heresies of the late Middle Ages. However, while the Protestant Reformation could be crushed in Spain with a few dozen executions in the 1550s, the same strategy failed in Germany, Northern Europe and in England. France had to suffer through the French wars of religion before it again became wholly Catholic. The divide between Catholicism and the new Protestant denominations was deep. Protestants commonly alleged that the Catholic Pope was the Antichrist. Conflicts between Christian factions reached the heights in France with the 1572 St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in Germany, and Central Europe with the 30 Years' War, and in England with the English Civil War. Following the devastations caused by these wars, the ideas of religious toleration, freedom of religion and religious pluralism slowly gained ground in Europe. The witch trials in early modern Europe, which had reached the height between 1550 and 1650, continued until 1750. European colonialism, that was accompanied by Christian evangelism and often by violence, led to the suppression of indigenous religions in the territories conquered or usurped by the Europeans. The Spanish colonization of the Americas largely destroyed the Aztec and Inca civilization. However, colonialism as a whole were not motivated by religious zeal. The suppression of the indigenous religions was the side result, not the main purpose. Only partial aspects, like the Goa Inquisition, bear resemblance to the persecutions that occurred on the European continent. By the 18th century, persecutions of unsanctioned beliefs had been reduced in most European countries to religious discrimination, in the form of legal restrictions on those who did not accept the official faith. This often included being barred from higher education, or from participation in the national legislature. In colonized nations, attempts to convert native peoples to Christianity became more encouraging and less forceful. In British India during the Victorian era, Christian converts were given preferential treatment for governmental appointments. At the present time, most countries in which Christianity is the religion of the majority of the people are either secular states or they embrace the separation of church and state in another way. Some recent political conflicts are sometimes considered as religious persecution. Among these, there is the case of the Hoover-Sac shootings in Vietnam on May 8, 1963, and the ethnic cleansing of Albanians, most of them Muslim, in Kosovo between 1992 and 1999, along with Bosnian Muslims. Christian Roman doctrine in 4th and 5th century A.D. After he had adopted Christianity following the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine I issued the Edict of Milan in 313. Since 306 there had already been several edicts that granted Christians religious toleration in parts of the empire, but the Edict of Milan removed all obstacles to the Christian faith and made the empire officially neutral with regard to religious worship. Constantine supported the church with his patronage. He had an extraordinary number of large basilicas built for the Christian church, and endowed it with land and other wealth. In doing this, however, he required the pagans to foot the bill. According to Christian chroniclers, it appeared necessary to Constantine to teach his subjects to give up the rites and to accustom them to despise the temples and the images contained therein, which led to the closure of pagan temples due to a lack of support. The wealth flowing to the imperial treasure. Constantine I did not need to use force to implement this. His his subjects are said to simply have obeyed him out of fear. Only the Chronicle of Theophanes has added that temples were annihilated, but this is considered not true by contemporary historians. According to the historian Ramsay MacMullen, Constantine desired to obliterate non-Christians, but lacking the means he had to be content with robbing their temples towards the end of his reign. He resorted to derogatory and contemptuous comments relating to the old religion, writing of the obstinacy of the pagans, of their misguided rites and ceremonial, and of their temples of lying, contrasted with the splendors of the home of truth. During the course of his life he progressively became more Christian and turned away from any syncretic tendencies he appeared to favor at times, and thus demonstrating, according to his biographers, that the God of the Christians was indeed a jealous God who tolerated no other gods beside him. The Church could never acknowledge that she stood on the same plane with other religious bodies. She conquered for herself one domain after another. After the 3-year reign of Julian the Apostate, who revived the Roman state paganism for a short time, the later Christian Roman emperors sanctioned attacks on pagan worship. Towards the end of the 4th century, Theodosius worked to establish Catholicism as the privileged religion in the Roman Empire. Theodosius was not the man to sympathize with the balancing policy of the Edict of Milan. He set himself steadfastly to the work of establishing Catholicism as the privileged religion of the state, of repressing dissident Christians, and of enacting explicit legal measures to abolish paganism in all its phases. 250 years after Constantine was converted and began the long campaign of official temple destruction and outlawing of non-Christian worship, Justinian was still engaged in the War of Dissent. The Augustinian Consensus. The transformation that happened in the 4th century lies at the heart of the debate between those Christian authors who advocated religious persecution and those who rejected it. Most of all, the advocates of persecution looked to the writings of Augustine of Hippo, the most influential of the Christian Church Fathers in the Latin West. Initially, he had been skeptical about the use of coercion in religious matters. However, he changed his mind after he had witnessed how the Donatists were brought over to the Catholic unity by fear of imperial edicts. Quote, "When Augustine had characterized himself in De Utilitate Credenti, he said he was Cupidus, very eager for truth, but in his 93 letter he described himself as Quietus Avidus, needing rest, and gave as reason the agitating Donatist. From a position that had trusted the power of philosophical argumentation, Augustine had moved to a position that emphasized the authority of the Church. Augustine had become convinced of the effectiveness of mild forms of persecution and developed a defense of the use. His authority on this question was undisputed for over a millennium in Western Christianity. Within this Augustinian consensus there was only disagreement about the extent to which Christians should persecute heretics. Augustine advocated fines, imprisonment, banishment and moderate floggings, but, according to Henry Chadwick, would have been horrified by the burning of heretics. Quote, "In late antiquity those burnings appear very rare indeed, the only certain case being the execution of Priscillian and 6 of his followers in 385. This sentence was roundly condemned by bishops like Ambrose, Augustine's mentor. The treatment of heretics with the adoption of Christianity by Constantine I. Heresy had become a political issue in the late Roman Empire. Adherents of unconventional Christian beliefs not covered by the Nicene Creed like Novatianism and Gnosticism were banned from holding meetings, but the Roman emperor intervened, especially in the conflict conflict between Orthodox and Arian Christianity, which resulted in the burning of Arian books. In contrast to the late antiquity, the execution of heretics was much more easily approved in the late Middle Ages, after the Christianization of Europe was largely completed. The first known case is the burning of 14 people at Orleans in 1022. In the following centuries, groups like the Bogomils, Waldensians, Cathars and Lollards were persecuted throughout Europe. The Fourth Council of the Lateran codified the theory and practice of persecution. In its third canon, the council declared, "Secular authorities, whatever office they may hold, shall be admonished and induced, and if necessarily compelled by ecclesiastical censure, to take an oath that they will strive to exterminate in the territories subject to their jurisdiction all heretics pointed out by the Church." St. Thomas Aquinas summed up the standard medieval position, when he declared that obstinate heretics deserved not only to be separated from the Church, but also to be eliminated from the world by death. The Old Testament has been the main source for Christian theologians advocating religious persecution. An example of this would be John Jewel. In defending the demand for religious uniformity by Elizabeth I of England, he declared, "Queen Elizabeth doth as did Moses, Josua, David, Solomon, Josias, Josaphat." The Protestant theory of persecution. The Protestant Reformation changed the face of Western Christianity forever, but initially it did nothing to change the Christian endorsement of religious persecution. The Reformers fully embraced Augustine's advocacy of coercion in religious matters, and many regarded the death penalty for heresy as legitimate. Furthermore, by presenting a much more powerful threat to Catholic unity than the heretic groups of the Middle Ages, the Reformation led to the intensification of persecution under Catholic regimes. Martin Luther had written against persecution in the 1520s, and had demonstrated genuine sympathy towards the Jews in his earlier writings, especially in Das Jesus Eingeborene Judäi from 1523, but after 1525 his position hardened. In Wieder die Sabbathern einen guten Freund, 1538, he still considered a conversion of the Jews to Christianity as possible, but in 1543 he published On the Jews and the Lies, a violent anti-Semitic tract. John Calvin helped to secure the execution for heresy of Michael Servetus, although he unsuccessfully requested that he should be beheaded instead of being burned at the stake. Effectively, however, the 16th-century Protestant view was less extreme than the medieval Catholic position. In England, John Fox, John Hales, Richard Perenchie, Herbert Thorndike and Jonas Prost all only saw mild forms of persecution against the English dissenters as legitimate, but this was only a retraction in degree, not a full rejection of religious persecution. There is also the crucial distinction between dissent and heresy to consider. Most dissenters disagreed with the Anglican Church only on secondary matters of worship and ecclesiology, and although this was considered a serious sin, only a few 17th-century Anglican writers thought that this crime deserved the death penalty. These concerns notwithstanding, the English government saw fit to execute as treasonous a multitude of priests, dissenters, and recusant Catholics, even those who retained but private reservations. The English Act of Supremacy thus significantly complicated the matter by securely welding church and state. The Elizabethan Bishop Thomas Bilson was of the opinion that men ought to be corrected, not murdered. But he did not condemn the Christian emperors for executing the Manichaeans for monstrous blasphemies. The Lutheran theologian Georgius Calixtus argued for the reconciliation of Christendom by removing all unimportant differences between Catholicism and Protestantism, and Rupertus Meldenius advocated in necessary eis unitas in dubiis libertas in omnibus curatis in 1626. Protestant advocacy for toleration. The English Protestant call for toleration, while the Christian theologians mentioned above advocated religious persecution to various extents. It was also Christians who helped pioneer the concept of religious toleration. In his book on the English Reformation, particularly in the chapter The Origins of Religious Toleration, the late A.G. Dickens argued that from the beginning of the Reformation there had existed in Protestant thought in Zwingli, Melanchthon and Bucer, as well as among the Anabaptists, a more liberal tradition, which John Frith was perhaps the first echo in England. Condemned for heresy, Frith was burnt at the stake in 1533. In his own mind, he died not because of the denial of the doctrines on purgatory and transubstantiation but for the principle that a particular doctrine on either point was not a necessary part of a Christian's faith. In other words, there was an important distinction to be made between a genuine article of faith and other matters where a variety of very different conclusions should be tolerated within the Church. This stand against unreasonable and profligate dogmatism meant that Frith, to a greater extent than any other of our early Protestants, upheld a certain degree of religious freedom. Frith was not alone. John Fox, for example, strove hard to save Anabaptists from the fire, and he enunciated a sweeping doctrine of tolerance even towards Catholics, whose doctrines he detested with every fibre of his being. In the early 17th century, Thomas Helwys was principal formulator of that distinctively Baptist request, that the Church and the State be kept separate in matters of law, so that individuals might have a freedom of religious conscience. Helwys said the king is a mortal man, and not God. Therefore he hath no power over the mortal soul of his subjects to make laws and ordinances for them and to set spiritual lords over them. King James I had Helwys thrown into Newgate prison, where he had died by 1616 at about the age of 40. By the time of the English Revolution, Helwys' stance on religious toleration was more commonplace. However, whilst accepting the zeal in desiring a godly society, some contemporary historians doubt whether the English Puritans during the English Revolution were as committed to religious liberty and pluralism as traditional histories have suggested. However, historian John Coffey's recent work emphasizes the contribution of a minority of radical Protestants who steadfastly sought toleration for heresy, blasphemy, Catholicism, non-Christian religions, and even atheism. This minority included the Seekers as well as the General Baptists and the Levites. The collective witness demanded the Church be an entirely voluntary, non-coercive community able to evangelize in a pluralistic society governed by a purely civil state. Such a demand was in sharp contrast to the ambitions of the magisterial Protestantism of the Calvinist majority. In 1644 the Augustinian Consensus concerning persecution was irreparably fractured. Quote, "This year can be identified quite exactly because 1644 saw the publication of John Milton's Areopagitica, William Walwyn's The Compassionate Samaritane, Henry Robinson's Liberty of Conscience, and Roger Williams' The Bloody Tenant of Persecution. These authors were Puritans and had dissented from the Church of England, and the radical Protestantism led them to condemn religious persecution, which they saw as a popish corruption of primitive Christianity. Other non-Anglican writers advocating toleration were Richard Doverton, John Wildman and John Goodwin, the Baptists Samuel Richardson and Thomas Collier, and the Quakers Samuel Fisher and William Penn. Anglicans who argued against persecution were John Locke, Anthony Ashley Cooper, 1st Earl of Shaftesbury, James Harrington, Jeremy Taylor, Henry Moore, John Tillotson and Gilbert Burnet. All of these considered themselves Christians or were actual churchmen. John Milton and John Locke are the predecessors of modern liberalism. Although Milton was a Puritan and Locke an Anglican, Areopagitica and a letter concerning toleration canonical liberal texts, only from the 1690s onwards the philosophy of deism emerged, and with it a third group that advocated religious toleration, but, unlike the radical Protestants and the Anglicans, also rejected biblical authority. This group prominently includes Voltaire, Frederick II of Prussia, Joseph II, Holy Roman Emperor Thomas Jefferson and the English-Irish philosopher John Toland. When Toland published the writings of Milton, Edmund Ludlow and Algernon Sidney, he tried to downplay the Puritan divinity in these works. The Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II issued the patent of toleration in 1781. Developments in 17th-century England following the debates that started in the 1640s. The Church of England was the first Christian church to grant adherents of other Christian denominations freedom of worship, with the Act of Toleration 1689, which nevertheless still retained some forms of religious discrimination and did not include toleration for Catholics. At present, only individuals who are members of the Church of England at the time of the succession may become the British monarch. In the United States, the Puritan Whig tradition of toleration did have the greatest effect not in England, but in the 13 colonies that would later form the United States. Notable tolerationists were directly involved in the founding of the colonies. Roger Williams founded the colony of Rhode Island, a haven for persecuted minorities. John Locke drafted the fundamental constitutions of Carolina and William Penn drew up the Constitution of Pennsylvania. Voltaire pointed the readers of his Traité sur la tolérance specifically to the examples of Carolina and Pennsylvania. People like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison and John Adams stood self-consciously in the tradition of Milton, Sidney and Locke, and extended the tolerationism further to also apply to Catholics and atheists. Coffey considers it possible to argue that the tolerationist tradition of 17th-century England reached its fulfillment in the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom and the First Amendment to the American Constitution, that the North American colonies and later the United States provided a refuge for religious minorities from Europe, partly explains the higher degree of religiosity in the contemporary United States and the unusual sectarian quality of U.S. Protestantism. Compared to Europe, the United States has a superabundance of denominations and sects as well as a far higher ratio of churchgoers, which importance the Christian religion should have in the United States, with its strong concept of separation of church and state, is a contentious question. For Kevin Phillips, who wrote a book with the polemical title American Theocracy, few questions will be more important to the 21st century United States than whether a nascent religion and its accompanying hubris will be carried on the nation's books as an asset or as a liability. According to a 2008 survey, 65% of U.S. American Christians believe that many religions can lead to eternal life. 52% of U.S. American Christians think that at least some non-Christian faiths can lead to eternal life. The mid-20th century Spanish model. As of the mid-20th century, an example of Catholic Church-state relations was the Catholic situation in Franco's Spain, where under the national Catholicism doctrine the Catholic Church was officially recognized and protected by the state, had substantial control over social policy, and had this relationship explicitly set out in a concordat. It had long been the policy of the Catholic Church to support toleration of competing religions under such a scheme, but to support legal restrictions on attempts to convert Catholics to those religions, under the motto that error has no rights.